What's up, guys? This is Chris from DraftDashboard.com.
Here are my DFS picks for NFL Week 11. Final look.
These picks apply for DraftKings and FanDuel. Before I get started, please drop a like on this video and hit that red subscribe button
And hit that bell icon
so you don't miss our new videos.
In this video, I'm going to go over each position and break down a couple of my favorite players for this NFL DFS main slate. And if you stick around to the very end of this video, we'll use the Draft Dashboard tools to make a DFS lineup using the picks we just made. Oh, and good news, guys. Make sure to stay tuned to the very end of this video because we removed the box that was popping up and blocking the lineup. So now you can see a full lineup using these picks that we made in this video if you stay to the very end. Okay, guys, NFL Week 11. Let's take a look at the quarterback position. So I like Patrick Mahomes from the Kansas City Chiefs playing the Dallas Cowboys, who have a good defense overall. They've been middle of the pack defending opposing quarterbacks. Patrick Mahomes has averaged 24.6 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 3.7 rush attempts per game. He's going to be about 12% owned, projected at 27.4 fantasy points here in Week 11. He's $7,600 DraftKings salary and $700 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 56.5 points scored in this game, with the Kansas City Chiefs favored by 2.5. So Patrick Mahomes, he had a bad few games, but he scored 39 fantasy points last game, so he's back on track. And I just think both of these quarterbacks, both Patrick Mahomes and Dak Prescott, are good quarterback plays because it's going to be a super high-scoring game. I think it's going to turn into a shootout. So I like Patrick Mahomes here versus the Dallas Cowboys. So I also like Josh Allen from the Buffalo Bills playing the Indianapolis Colts, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall, and they give up the 5th most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. Josh Allen has averaged 26.3 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 6.6 rush attempts per game. He's going to be about 9% owned, projected at 24.9 fantasy points here in Week 11. He's $8,100 DraftKings salary, $700 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 49.5 points scored in this game, with the Buffalo Bills favored by 7.5. So you got a pretty high scoring game here, a great quarterback matchup, and I like the rushing floor that you get from Josh Allen. He scored 25, 13, and 30 fantasy points in the last 3 games, and he got 2, 5, and 8 rush attempts in those games. So I like Josh Allen here versus the Indianapolis Colts. Okay, and the other quarterback, I already mentioned him, but I like Dak Prescott from the Dallas Cowboys playing the Kansas City Chiefs, who have the 8th worst defense overall, and they give up the 2nd most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. Dak Prescott has averaged 24 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 3.3 rush attempts per game. He's going to be about 7% owned, projected at 22.7 fantasy points here in Week 11. He's $7,200 DraftKings salary and $1,200 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 56.5 points scored in this game, with the Cowboys trailing by 2.5. So Dak Prescott has scored 26 and 20 fantasy points in the last 2 games. Now he's got a fantastic matchup here versus the Kansas City Chiefs in a high-scoring game. In a game they might fall behind. It could turn into a shootout. I think it will. I think both of these quarterbacks are good plays from this game. And it looks like I'm going to be paying up at quarterback this week. So I like Dak Prescott here versus the Kansas City Chiefs. Now, if you do want to save some salary at the quarterback position, you got a guy like Ryan Tannehill, but he is only 500 less than Dak Prescott. Then you got a guy like Derek Carr, who does have 20 plus fantasy point upside, but the Las Vegas Raiders have been struggling a little bit, so I just don't see what quarterback you're going to go with to save salary. Possibly a guy like Tua Tagovailoa. He's got a good matchup versus the Jets. Or you could roll the dice with Cam Newton, who just came back from the Carolina Panthers and scored a rushing touchdown last week. He's got a fantastic matchup versus the Washington football team. But that looks like pretty high risk, high reward. Although at only $5,100, you are going to save a ton of salary. And if he gets a rushing touchdown to boost up his fantasy points, could be a decent play there. But just looking at these quarterbacks, maybe you could go with a guy like Russell Wilson. But again, I think I'm just going to pay up at the quarterback position and take a guy like Josh Allen, Lamar Jackson, Patrick Mahomes, or Dak Prescott. Okay guys, it's time to announce the winner of our $25 PayPal giveaway. So the winner is Harrison Edgar. Congratulations, Harrison Edgar. You are the winner of our $25 weekly PayPal giveaway. Please reply to our comment to collect your prize.
Before I continue with the picks, I'm excited today because we added a new contest for everyone watching.
If you want to enter the drawing for $25 PayPal,
all you need to do is like this video, hit that subscribe button, and make a quick comment below to be entered into the drawing. We'll reply to a random comment and let you know that you won.
And we'll send you $25 PayPal.
So it's that easy, and we pick a new winner every Saturday and announce them in our video. So get your comment in now so I can add another entry for you.
Okay, let's take a look at the running back position. I like Joe Mixon from the Cincinnati Bengals playing the Las Vegas Raiders, who have the 10th worst defense overall, and they give up the 7th most fantasy points to opposing running backs. Joe Mixon has averaged 18 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 16.7 rush attempts per game and 2.9 pass targets per game. He's going to be about 6% owned, projected at 16.7 fantasy points here in week 11. He's $7,600 DraftKings salary and the same price on FanDuel. So I like that FanDuel price. Vegas thinks there's going to be 50 points scored in this game, with the Bengals favored by 1. So you got a high scoring game, a great matchup here, and Joe Mixon has scored 28, 25, and 12 fantasy points over the last 3 games. And he got 13, 14, and 12 rush attempts the last 3 games, but he did get 5 pass targets in each of his last 2 games, so he can be involved quite a bit in the passing game, averaging about 20 touches per game. So I like Joe Mixon here versus the Las Vegas Raiders. Okay, another running back that I like is A.J. Dillon from the Green Bay Packers playing the Minnesota Vikings, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall, and they give up the 10th most fantasy points to opposing running backs. A.J. Dillon has scored 27 and 13 fantasy points in his last 2 games, but really now that he's the feature running back, he scored 27 fantasy points last game off of 21 rush attempts and 2 pass targets. He's going to be about 22% owned, projected at 17.6 fantasy points here in week 11. He's $6,200 DraftKings salary and $800 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 47.5 points scored in this game, with the Green Bay Packers favored by 1. So he's got a good matchup. He got a ton of volume last week, and I expect that to continue again here in week 11. So I like A.J. Dillon here versus the Minnesota Vikings. I also like James Conner from the Arizona Cardinals playing the Seattle Seahawks, who have the 12th worst defense overall. They give up the second most fantasy points to opposing running backs. James Conner has averaged 14.8 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 12.5 rush attempts per game and 1.4 pass targets per game. He's going to be about 15% owned, projected at 16 fantasy points here in Week 11. He's 6,100 DraftKings salary and 1,100 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 48 points scored in this game, with the Cardinals favored by 1.5. So great matchup versus the Seahawks. And James Conner, he's been getting a lot more volume lately. He got 10 and 21 rush attempts the last 2 games and 4 and 5 pass targets. So they are feeding James Conner the ball quite a bit. So I like this matchup. I like the price tag, and I like his upside. James Conner has scored 15, 40, and 14 fantasy points in the last 3 games. So I like James Conner here versus the Seattle Seahawks. Now for studs on the slate, of course, I like Christian McCaffrey and Dalvin Cook, and I also like Ezekiel Elliott. So you got a good mix of studs and lower priced running backs on this slate. And if you are looking to save some salary at the running back position, take a look at D'Onta Foreman from the Tennessee Titans playing the Houston Texans, who have the second worst defense overall, and they give up the 5th most fantasy points to opposing running backs. D'Onta Foreman, he scored 10 fantasy points last game off of 11 rush attempts and 2 pass targets. He's going to be about 7% owned, projected at 11 fantasy points here in Week 11, and he's only 4,900 DraftKings salary. He's 1,300 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 45 points scored in this game, with the Tennessee Titans favored by 10.5. So you got a fantastic matchup and what could be a running game script. So we could get a bunch of touches in this game at low salary, and that ownership is relatively low. So I like D'Onta Foreman here versus the Houston Texans.
Real quick, guys, I got great news. For a limited time, we're offering a full 30-day trial to Draft Dashboard. You can try all the tools for NFL, MLB is still going, NBA is right around the corner. This is a great time to get in and try everything for 1 month. The tools are all about saving research time. You can see the last 3 games, the fantasy points per game, the targets they got per game, so you can see how involved they are in the offense, the rushes they got per game. Seeing all this stuff on one screen helps you save time and make better picks. Oh, and if you're tired of doing research every day, we just added a cheat sheet that shows hand-picked plays for the slate. No confusing stat lines, no headaches, just a simple cheat sheet that shows the absolute best players for your lineups.
Okay, let's take a look at the wide receiver position. So the studs on the slate, I like Devontae Adams, Tyreek Hill, Stephon Diggs. But if we're digging down to save some salary here, I like Brandon Cooks from the Houston Texans playing the Tennessee Titans, who have the 7th worst defense overall, and they give up the absolute most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. Brandon Cooks has averaged 15.5 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 9.3 pass targets per game. He's on the field for 89% of the snaps, going to be about 9% owned, projected at 14.7 fantasy points here in Week 11. He's 6,000 DraftKings salary and 600 more on FanDuel. So we know Vegas thinks there's going to be 45 points scored in this game, with the Texans trailing by 10.5. So Brandon Cooks has a fantastic matchup in what should be a passing game script. He's getting a ton of volume this season. He got 13 pass targets last week, scored 12 fantasy points, scored 20 fantasy points the week before that off of 6 pass targets. So this could be a game you play D'Onta Foreman and then run him back with Brandon Cooks. So I like Brandon Cooks here versus the Tennessee Titans. Another wide receiver I like, you want to save some salary, I like Jalen Waddle from the Miami Dolphins playing the New York Jets, who have the absolute worst defense overall, and they give up the 10th most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. Jalen Waddle has averaged 13.3 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 8.5 pass targets per game. He's on the field for 84% of the snaps. He's going to be about 14% owned, projected at 14.6 fantasy points here in week 11. He's only 5,600 DraftKings salary. He's 1,100 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 44.5 points scored in this game, with the Dolphins favored by 3.5. So Jalen Waddle's got a fantastic matchup. He scored 10, 16, and 7 fantasy points in the last 3 games off of 6, 10, and 12 pass targets. So he's getting a ton of volume. So I like Jalen Waddle here versus the New York Jets. Okay, now here is a salary saver. Well, I like Rashad Bateman from the Baltimore Ravens playing the Chicago Bears, who have the 6th worst defense overall. They give up the 2nd most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. Rashad Bateman has averaged 10.5 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 7 pass targets per game. While he's been playing, he's been on the field for 100% of the snaps, only going to be about 3% owned, projected at 11.1 fantasy points here in week 11. He's 4,500 DraftKings salary. And he's 1,300 more on FanDuel. So Rashad Bateman, I think he's underpriced for the targets and the production that he's had in the past 3 games. He scored 14, 10, and 11 fantasy points in the last 3 games off of 8, 8, and 6 pass targets. So he's got a great matchup. Vegas thinks there's going to be 44.5 points scored in this game, with the Ravens favored by 6. So I like Rashad Bateman as a value play here versus the Chicago Bears. Okay, another value play that I like this week is Michael Gallup from the Dallas Cowboys playing the Kansas City Chiefs, who have the 8th worst defense overall. They give up the 12th most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. Michael Gallup has averaged 7.4 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 6 pass targets per game. While he's been healthy, he's been on the field for 100% of the snaps. He's going to be about 12% owned, projected at 12.6 fantasy points here in week 11. And he's only 4,200 DraftKings salary. He's 1,200 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 56.5 points scored in this game, with the Cowboys trailing by 2.5. So I just think Michael Gallup is a low salary play here to get some exposure to this Dallas Cowboys Kansas City Chiefs game, which should be a high scoring game. So I like Michael Gallup here versus the Kansas City Chiefs. Okay, moving on to the tight end position. So I like Travis Kelce. He's always a stud, but if you want to save some salary and play another stud at the tight end position, I like George Kittle from the San Francisco 49ers playing the Jacksonville Jaguars, who have a middle of the pack defense overall, and they give up the 10th most fantasy points to opposing tight ends. George Kittle has averaged 13.8 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 7.2 pass targets per game. He's been on the field for 100% of the snaps. He's only going to be about 7% owned, projected at 14.9 fantasy points here in week 11. He's 6,300 DraftKings salary and 500 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 45.5 points scored in this game, with the 49ers favored by 6.5. So pretty close game here versus the Jacksonville Jaguars, within a touchdown. Not going to be a blowout, at least according to the Las Vegas lines. So George Kittle has scored 16, 24, and 8 fantasy points in the last 3 games off of 7, 8, and 11 pass targets. So I like George Kittle here versus the Jacksonville Jaguars. Now I just think this guy is ready to explode, so I like Darren Waller from the Las Vegas Raiders playing the Cincinnati Bengals, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall. They're middle-of-the-pack defending opposing tight ends. Darren Waller has averaged 13.6 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 8.9 pass targets per game. He's on the field for 90% of the snaps, going to be about 13% owned, projected at 15.1 fantasy points here in Week 11. He's 6,100 DraftKings salary and 600 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 50 points scored in this game, with the Raiders trailing by 1. So Darren Waller has scored 6 and 16 fantasy points in the last 2 games off of 7 and 11 pass targets. This guy's got monster upside, getting a bunch of volume, so I like Darren Waller here versus the Cincinnati Bengals. Now I also like Mark Andrews, but if you want to save some salary at the tight end position and go with a guy that's been getting a ton of volume over the past 3 weeks, take a look at Dan Arnold from the Jacksonville Jaguars playing the San Francisco 49ers, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall. They've been pretty good versus opposing tight ends. Dan Arnold has averaged 8.3 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 5.7 pass targets per game. He's going to be about 7% owned, projected at 10.6 fantasy points here in Week 11. He's 4,100 DraftKings salary and 1,300 more on FanDuel. So Vegas thinks there's going to be 45.5 points scored in this game, with the Jacksonville Jaguars trailing by 6.5. So probably going to turn into a passing game script for the Jaguars as they fall behind the 49ers. And Dan Arnold has scored 14, 10, and 15 fantasy points in the last 3 games off of 7, 7, and 10 pass targets. So I like Dan Arnold here versus the San Francisco 49ers.
If you want to try all these daily fantasy tools for yourself, click the link in the description below this video or just go to draftdashboard.com. You can use our DFS lineup optimizer to build quality lineups using our picks and your own custom player pool. Click the link in the description below this video and try all these daily fantasy tools right now. Thanks so much for watching. Oh, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel and hit that bell icon so you can get instant updates whenever we post a new video. Thank you so much for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this video, please smickety smash that like button and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Oh, and please comment below with your favorite player for this NBA slate. I love to hear what you guys have to think. Thanks again, and good luck.